So, hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. This week we're joined by our Executive Director, Frank Füredi. Welcome, Frank.
Nice to talk to you.
And we're also joined by Richard Schenk, one of our research fellows. Richard, thanks for coming back.
Hi, nice to be here.
Today we're going to tackle a few things. Most importantly, we're going to start with the upcoming elections in France. Then we're going to turn over to our attention to look at the start of the Hungarian presidency. And we'll also touch on an election that's taking place in the UK. So, French are going to head to the polls for the second round of this kind of very historic French election. Obviously everyone knows that the first round saw a huge result for the Rassemblement National, and now things have very much moved into almost like a game of scheming about who's going to withdraw from where, with the overall aim really of kind of establishing this cordon sanitaire again around Le Pen's party. Richard, you've been diving into some of the places where withdrawals may or may not help either Macron's party or the Left Alliance, but could you explain how things are shaping up?
Well, we have had a record amount of so-called triangulaires in French, which means that in the second round, not two candidates, but three candidates moved on. This gives the political parties a lot of maneuver and opportunities to bargain. And obviously, the challenge is who is going to withdraw strategically, tactically, in whose favor. And what we have seen is that in over 200 constituencies out of the 577, there has been some kind of arrangement against the Rassemblement National. So either the leftist candidate by the Nouveau Front Populaire withdraw, or Macron's candidate by the Ensemble coalition withdrew. But with the aim to stop the Rassemblement National. But this is a very, very tricky situation, because somebody withdrew or because the parties issued a declaration that they are in support of another candidate, that by far it does not mean that the voter is going to vote for this candidate in the second round. A lot of vote on the leftist side was an anti-establishment vote, but for the Nouveau Front Populaire, people who really do not like Macron voted in favor of the leftist coalition, and it's very, very likely that large chunks of these votes, like if you are living in a district where the leftist candidate withdrew in favor of a Macronist candidate, is not going to go directly to Macron. Because also the voters have the option to just stay at home, or new voters who are coming into the second round. And we basically have no data on this issue. So it's a very unpredictable situation that could end up in an absolute majority for Rassemblement National or in a defeat. But what is clear now after the first round, that Macron has lost his majority, and the best outcome for him is some kind of hung parliament situation where he can appoint a technocrat government.
Yeah, and Frank, I mean, Richard touched on this, but the way in which it's kind of presented in the mainstream media, at least, is that this is almost a done deal because they've tallied up the votes that would have gone to the alliance, added them to Macron vote, and in most cases you got like the Rassemblement National are going to do well, but they stand little chance realistically of kind of being able to form the government and winning the majority. But as Richard's alluded to, things are not that simple. Do you think that this attempt to form this kind of new cordon sanitaire around the Rassemblement National, is it going to work, and what's really at stake in the election?
Well, you can no longer have a cordon sanitaire in the old sense, because that's broken down by the mere fact that 1 out of 3 French voters voted for the RN. So that basically means that this doesn't exist anymore. However, what they can do, and what they're trying to do, is to create a tactical dynamic where they pull together anybody who's not on the side of the RN to simply go and vote against the RN. So the election, from their point of view, is an entirely negative affair where they're basically trying to prevent the largest party from gaining even more support and potentially gaining power. And that's really quite important. It says something about the way that democratic public life is conducted in France, because they basically talk about Republican principles, as if somehow Republican principles imply this kind of very negative approach towards the election. Now, if this was 5 years ago, I would bet a lot of money on the fact that they would succeed in preventing the RN from making very much headway. I mean, RN will get a sizable vote, but not enough to form anything like a majority. And 5 years ago, I think most people would have listened to the two parties, to Macron's party and also to the left Front Populaire. However, today, I think that the voters are no longer as compliant as they would have been in the past. They no longer just simply go along with the signal that's sent out by the main parties. And I think there will be a fair number of people who voted for a Macron candidate who cannot stomach voting for the left. And as Richard was saying, there's a lot of people who voted for the left who simply cannot imagine voting for Macron's party. So it is possible that a large percentage, or at least a sizable percentage, from these two parties, supporters will abstain, will not go out to vote. And I think in the end, probably the most decisive element in this has got to do with the voter turnout. To what extent voters who, in their heart of hearts, prefer the RN to any of the other parties but didn't vote last time, actually decide to go out and give the RN a chance to govern. I think that's the key issue, the number of people that go out and vote.
Yeah, and Rich, I mean, maybe you might be aware of any information concerning what they're projecting turnout to look like or things like that. But another issue I wanted to touch on with the both of you is the way in which already, even after the first round of elections, there was this kind of attempt by especially members on the left to already portray the result as being kind of illegitimate somehow and not really accepting the democratic process, and immediately, obviously in a slightly French tradition, but certainly taking to the streets, and this sense that people will be saying in various ways and forms, but this is not if the RN form a government, they'll be very clear to say, this is not my government, I don't respect its authority. And that dynamic seems to me to be quite a dangerous one, where you immediately delegitimize the democratic process by saying that you don't effectively accept the result.
Well, to begin with the predictions, there are some polls floating around before the second round, but the data for this polls is very, very weak, because people need some days to realize which candidate they have had, who withdrew it, in whose favor, and also to be honest, what would undermine truly the legitimacy of these elections would be a really concerted effort for withdrawal that would be blatantly trying to would be very blatant in its attempt to block Rassemblement National from gaining power. But it is not that easy that just leftist coalition and Macron team up and all these 500 constituencies that are still open, they block Rassemblement National. Within the leftist coalitions, there are huge cracks. Macron himself also has a coalition, actually. It's not a unified single party. He has, for example, the Horizon party led by former Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, who has already proclaimed that the main goal for him is to block the leftist coalition from gaining mandates. So this is at some points in some constituencies, in 218 exactly, we have had some kind of cooperation, but in the other ones we did have no tactical withdrawals. So I think this is not enough to undermine the legitimacy of the election process itself so far.
Yeah, Frank, I mean, in the last podcast, we touched on a little the fact that there was kind of these suggestions among the kind of financial elite and the bureaucratic elite in France that they weren't going to work with the RN government. And it seems to me that the reaction to the first election is that kind of sense is spreading a little bit further in kind of elite kind of French society. What do you make of this sense that nobody would accept, or not the kind of elite in France would not accept an RN government?
I think in at least outwardly they would have to accept a democratically elected government, but at the same time they would basically create all kinds of obstacles to prevent that government from functioning, or at least passing policies with which they disagree. I'm much more worried about the way in which other institutions, the civil service, for example, the constitutional court in France, but also the people on the streets and their kind of behavior, that may well thwart or create a lot of instability should the RN get a majority and be moving towards gaining political power. I thought it was very, very interesting that the media in France made it very difficult for people to actually know that there were all these riots going on all over France, and shops were being burned down, and you had a massive rioting going on in Bobigny, which is a suburb of Paris, taking place. None of that was reported, and certainly in the European press, you could barely see any of that occurring. And that was already an indication that for a lot of people, they have a carte blanche to riot and protest if the RN gets elected, and to basically try to delegitimate this particular event from taking place. So there's a lot of forces, a kind of a coalition that has emerged that is going to do their best to make sure that no matter what the people decide in the ballot box, they're going to prevent the RN from coming to power.
Well, turning our attention now to the start of the Hungarian presidency, it began with a bit of a bang, with a wide amount of outrage over the choice of the slogan "Make Europe Great Again." We've released a couple of videos on this, and we certainly think that there's nothing wrong with suggesting that Europe could be certainly a lot greater than it is now, and we could make Europe great again. But there have been a number of events that have kicked the presidency off. Obviously, they've announced that there's going to be a large focus on solving Europe's competitiveness issue, which we're going to focus on here. And you also saw in the press lots of people kind of smugly saying, or kind of breathing a sigh of relief, that there's not that much legislative work, etc., to be done in this period, so aren't we lucky that that Orbán's in charge at this moment. But one of the signal features maybe of the start to the presidency was Orbán's trip to Kiev to go and meet Zelensky, and out of that came a couple of interesting announcements. But Frank, Richard, what have you made of the start to the presidency? Has this trip to Kiev maybe wrong-footed a few people?
I think it did. I think people realize or beginning to realize that Orbán isn't this cardboard figure that they can just simply predict what's going to happen with him, because they have this kind of fantasy image of Orbán as this troublemaker, this bad boy of Europe, not realizing that he's actually quite a smooth operator, and he understands that he has a role to play, which is to basically act in the interest of EU, not just simply that of one nation. And I think that what Orbán did was basically indicate that he takes diplomacy seriously, that when it comes to playing by the rules, he's quite accomplished in relation to that. And I think it was really interesting that he managed to go to Kiev, have a relatively friendly, at least outwardly friendly discussion with Zelensky, and demonstrate that there is more than one way of managing or reacting to the war in the Ukraine. So I thought that was a really plus for him that he did that. And I'll bet you that by the time he's finished, people will be surprised, because Orbán is going to do a lot of stuff that isn't what people expect him to do. He's going to not play the role that's assigned to him, but he's going to find ways of getting his ideals across in a slightly creative way.
I think if you think about the EU institutions currently, right now in July 2024, we are in a state of transition. And it tells us a lot that actually the council president, which is only a council president of the ministers' council, not of the European Council, has this prominent role now. And this is very much due to the fact that we have actually two lame ducks who are there. Charles Michel, who has already been not re-elected as president of the European Council, who usually would compete for public attention from Viktor Orbán. And also we have the High Representative, who has also not been renominated for his post by the European Council. So actually, somehow Orbán's role became more prominent than it's actually supposed to be by the institutions, EU treaties. And as Frank already said, he didn't use this that much to profile himself as many of his enemies would have expected. Actually, the details of the meetings were quite. The press conference was very discreet about was very face-saving for both sides, and we shouldn't underestimate that. Viktor Orbán is the longest serving prime minister in Europe who has a tremendous amount of experience and running negotiations. And maybe this could be a very beneficial for Europe.
Yeah, well, we'll certainly keep a close eye on some of the events surrounding the presidency. And as I would repeat, I think it really did wrong foot people, this trip to Kiev, and some interesting things came out of it. For example, Orbán promising to open schools for the Ukrainian refugees that are in Hungary, and also getting something of a joint communique on the road towards peace. So plenty of interesting stuff that we'll keep a close eye on. But we wanted to turn next to the elections in the UK. The story of the elections, a bit like in France, is that there's a huge amount of political instability. But in the UK, it seems to have taken a slightly different shape. People who have been following it will know that the headline result is certainly the collapse of the Tory party. But Frank, what do you think is kind of especially relevant for us here in Europe about what's going on in the UK?
I think that number one is the fact that the oldest political party in Europe, which is the Conservative Party, is somehow unraveling to the point at which its very survival is now called into question. And that's really important because it is the last major party that's been around throughout the 20th century that is still in existence. And when you think about what happened in Britain in a few years since the last election, the way the Tory majority has just dissipated, it is a political earthquake. It's a very unusually boring election because all the parties are careful not to say anything controversial. All the parties are very, very careful not to be caught out. And it's, an election with hardly any argument and debate. The only interesting thing that has occurred is that the Reform Party, which is not really a party, but is a private company run by a guy called Richard Tice, a kind of right-wing, semi-populist party, has really gained a lot of momentum because Nigel Farage, the old head of the Brexit movement, has joined it. And Farage's charisma and the fact that he has got a real presence in comparison to the other politicians has created a certain momentum which will lead to intensifying the crisis of the Conservative Party because they're going to lose a lot of seats because of the fact that the vote will be split as Reform candidates will eat up their votes. But also it will lead to the creation of a new right-wing party which will have members in parliament for the first time because it's likely that they will get anything between 5 and 9 members of parliament if the polls are right.
Yeah, Richard, I mean, for the people not familiar with the UK system, I mean, Europeans looking at it must be kind of shocked that there are these various parties, I mean, like Reform, which could poll anywhere between 16 and 20 or 20+%, and they could only end up with a couple of representatives. But what have you made of the election in the UK?
Well, the historical strength of the UK system was that it forced the major parties to integrate a broad political spectrum under the electoral umbrella. So the Tories used to have very centrist elements and very right-wing elements, and as the Tories failed to stand up to this responsibility they had due to the electoral system to integrate different positions, something like the Reform Party could emerge. And I think it's very remarkable that the most successful social democratic party in Europe basically is the Labour Party right now, because in all the other big European states, they lost a lot of ground in the recent decade. And we will see that, I think, what the Labour government will have tremendous problems to stand up to this reputation, to integrate all these votes, all these different societal groups into the government agenda, and they will very much focus on domestic politics, UK politics in the upcoming time. So many people in the European establishment who hope for Britain rejoining the EU. I think a future Prime Minister Keir Starmer has way bigger fish to fry than re-entering negotiations with the EU.
Yeah, and the point to make is obviously that the vote for the Labour Party in the UK is not necessarily a mandate in the traditional sense. So if you look at all the polls published and one published today or yesterday, it was close to half the voters voting for the Labour Party. They're biggest reason was to kick the Tories out. There was nothing about the rest of the program of the Labour Party. So there's no sense that this is kind of as you say, actually a healthy kind of left-wing or social democratic political movement.
I mean, the Labour Party ceased to be a social democratic party for some time ago. And although it's got a minority of members of parliament, individuals, who self-consciously define themselves as socialists, the party itself, in terms of its centrist technocratic ambition, tends to resemble the kind of centrist sister parties throughout Europe in terms of what it's really all about. I think it's interesting that the quality of the members of the candidates running for parliament, as I kind of picked it up, is unusually low. I mean, we have a political class in Britain that consists of people that in a different era would have been like town councillors or sort of had small positions within local government. They are now going to become members of parliament and run the country. But when you look at them and you talk to them, you realize that they are not like a substantial political class. So there is a very major political crisis in Britain, a crisis of leadership, which is a very worrying development.
Still, they are in better shape than many other socialist or social democratic parties in Europe, this is. I mean, I agree with Frank on many things. Just in a European comparison, look at France across the Channel. Okay, now the Social Democrats or the Socialist Party there is happy to achieve 16% of the votes. This is far from the results they used to have under François Mitterrand. The German Social Democrats got 15% of the vote. So this is, I think, the European social democracy has lost a lot of its traditional coal electorate to new competitors, partly to the European People's Party attached parties, but a lot to the far right. Many people went into abstention, and Keir Starmer will not be able to have the same stance in the European social democracy than for the big leaders like Mitterrand or Willy Brandt or Olof Palme used to have.
And there's a little bit of a bonus, something we haven't discussed on the podcast yet, is obviously a very important event for us Europeans, which is the Euros, which are currently going on. And I mean, not just because I've been following England as an Englishman, that I think that, has this tournament been a uniquely boring tournament? I mean, Frank, you said that about the UK election, but there's something missing from this tournament. It's certainly not the crowds. We've seen great crowds and really amazing displays of support and fans and stuff in Germany, so it looks like the atmosphere is right, but it seems to me that this is a slightly boring tournament, and maybe we should start asking the question kind of what's gone wrong with international football.
I know. I mean, I was astonished how boring it has become. There were a few good games, and sometimes you can see Germany and Switzerland play with flair and come alive. You can tell that Spain has got a really solid, excellent team, and that England, for all its faults, can always pull a rabbit out of the hat at the very, very last minute. But I think what has happened is that possibly the wear and tear of the football season, which certainly is something that a lot of footballers talk about, may have limited the athleticism and the capacity of many of the players to put on a good show. But to me, the symptom of the crisis of the football, European football, was demonstrated by Italy, who put on who's usually one of the most interesting teams around, who put on such boring performances and are now obviously out, that it does call into question, well, what's happening to European football? But I'm fairly sure that in the end, England will win. There's very little doubt about it. So, yeah.
I'd like to believe that's true. But, Richard, I mean, for me, this tournament has been the symptom of the decline of football is spelled out in the imposition of VAR. Like, we like to complain a lot about detached technocrats and their influence on politics here. I think a similar thing is happening with football with regard to VAR. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, Denmark were robbed in the game against Germany by two incredibly just bizarre decisions that revolve around VAR. But what is your diagnosis of the problem?
I mean, if we introduce VAR, we maybe have to change the rules as well, because if you can measure an offside so precisely, then we should maybe change the rules that our toe is not enough to cause an offside. But what I want to say as a German on the tournament so far, the tournament is good, but this is what we would expect from Germany. It has the reputation of being a football nation. It should have very good stadiums, very good infrastructure,
lots of beer,
lots of beer. And as far as it goes, I'm not satisfied with the organization of the tournament in Germany, because it should be not 90% good, it should be 100% good, because we are. I mean, it's one of the leading industrial nations in the world that should be able to do a 100% fine tournament. Yeah. So, and as far as it goes, we had a lot of delayed trains. We had
well, I was in Berlin recently. I'm hearing lots of complaints from people about delayed trains and fans not able to get around. But I guess the decline of Germany, or the struggles in Germany, we'll have to address a little bit more in the podcast. But for now, thanks for joining us on the MCC Brussels podcast. And Richard, Frank, thanks so much.